She believed she would spend the night alone, isolated in a secluded woodland shelter when a fierce storm came across the Montana highlands. But just after dusk, something big emerged from the trees and she was confronted by a fully grown. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so that we can bring you more real, unforgettable animal stories straight to you. The grizzly bear, instead of attacking, curled up beside her, silent and soaking wet, as if seeking warmth rather than a fight. They survived that night together, and then the bear disappeared months later. The woman initially believed it was a one-time occurrence, but upon the bear's return, the experience left her speechless and filled with tears. Green had always been the kind of woman who chose solitude over comfort. She didn't run from people exactly, but the quiet spaces between words had always felt more honest than the noise of the city after a painful divorce and the loss of her younger brother to cancer. The previous year she'd taken a long sabbatical from her job at the university. She packed a backpack, grabbed her old trail maps and went looking for silence in the forest. What she found was something else entirely. The storm had come out of nowhere. Mara had reached the edge of a steep ridge just past midday when she noticed the clouds shifting unnaturally fast. By the time she reached the nearest trail marker, the wind was howling hard enough to bend branches. Rain followed like a wall. Visibility dropped to nothing. She had no choice but to take shelter. There was an old fire lookout cabin she had passed on her way up, barely more than a structure of logs and rusted nails, but with a roof and a door that shut. She ran back toward it, soaked and stumbling. When she pushed open the door, the air inside smelled like mold and pine, but it was dry. She lit a small lantern, laid out her sleeping bag, ate half a protein bar, and waited. The storm grew louder. The roof creaked under the weight of water, and wind. Branches slammed against the side of the cabin. Mara curled up by the wall, hugging her knees, the lantern flickering. Then she heard it. Not the storm, not thunder, a sound outside, heavy, rhythmic, purposeful footsteps. When the door creaked open slowly, as if pushed by something large and cautious, Mara froze. Another step, let out a low, breathy exhale, and reached for her bear spray but didn't uncap it. And then, in the flickering light, she saw it. A full-grown grizzly bear that was wet and glistening stepped halfway into the doorway for the second time, collapsed, didn't scream, didn't move, and didn't charge. With her head slightly cocked, Mara entered the cabin carefully and gracefully, curling up in the furthest corner. She watched the bear, which seemed to be watching the storm, in complete silence for the next 2 hours. Outside, trees snapped, wind screamed, and two creatures, one wild and one human, sat together in the same flimsy shelter, surviving side by side. When dawn came, the bear stood, shook off her fur, looked at Mara again, then stepped out into the wet morning light and disappeared into the trees. Mara remained seated for a long time, her hands still clenched around the bear spray she never used. She had spent the first 3 days in a cabin with a grizzly bear, and she didn't tell anyone about it. Not because she was scared, but rather because she didn't know how to explain it without coming across as hallucinogenic. The muddy paw prints were still on the cabin floor. Her sleeping bag still smelled like damp fur and pine. But how do you tell that story and expect someone to believe you. Back in Missoula, she returned to her small house on the edge of town. A garden, overgrown with weeds, welcomed her like nothing had changed. The neighbors waved politely. Her inbox was full. The world had kept moving, but Mara had not. Something had shifted in her, a kind of stillness she couldn't shake, like part of the forest had followed her home. It started with the scratches, 3 thin deliberate marks, etched into the old wood post by her back gate. At first she thought it was a raccoon, then the paw prints appeared, large, precise, in the soft soil just beyond her garden fence. She stared at them for a long time, half waiting for them to vanish like something imagined. But they were real. Then came the bones, clean arranged, not gruesome, almost ritualistic, a cleaned rabbit skull left beneath her porch swing one morning, perfectly centered on the welcome mat, a gesture, a token, not a threat. And in that moment Mara knew. She remembered, and she had come back. Mara tried to tell a friend, someone she'd known for years, someone who hiked, someone who believed in animal wisdom, whatever that meant. She listened, smiled, tilted her head, and gently asked Mara if she'd spoken to anyone since the divorce. That was the last time Mara brought it up. She began keeping a small logbook tucked beneath the couch cushion. She noted every sound, every time she found new prints, scratches, bones. She drew little sketches of the shapes left in the dirt, the places where bark had been gently scraped off trees, and always the same direction, always toward her house, as if the bear were leaving breadcrumbs back to her one night. The wind was fierce again, a minor storm, and Mara was unable to sleep. She lit a candle and sat by the glass door, wrapped in a wool blanket. She didn't anticipate anything, but at 2:14 a.m., the motion light clicked on, and she froze outside, right at the edge of the garden. She stood there, massively still, a silhouette of memory and muscle outlined in pale light. The grizzly didn't move or make a sound, so Mara pressed her palm to the glass. The bear turned her head slightly, but not in an aggressive or alarmed manner, and Mara recognized it in that expression. The bear then slowly turned and returned to the trees. The next morning Mara found something on the porch. Not bones, not a threat, a smooth river stone scratched into its surface as if by claw or fang, almost like a fingerprint or a path. She stared at it for minutes, then whispered to herself, "You came back," and felt the tears gather. Not from fear but from something she hadn't felt in years, meaning the spiral on the stone wouldn't leave Mara's mind. She tried to dismiss it, told herself it was probably just scratches from sliding down a stream, or rubbing against rock, but she couldn't ignore the way it had been placed, deliberate, centered, waiting on her porch like a message left in a language older than she understood. The next morning Mara packed a small bag, just water, a map, and a flashlight. She didn't tell anyone. She hadn't told anyone anything in weeks. Not since she realized no one believed her. She left at sunrise, following the back trail that led from her garden to the ridgeline. It was the same route she used to take with her brother years ago. He had loved it, especially in early fall when the leaves began to crisp and the deer paths cut clearly through the brush. Mara walked slow, watched everything, and after about an hour she saw the first sign. A pine branch snapped clean at the end and wedged horizontally between 2 trunks in the middle of the morning. Mara arrived at the base of a narrow ravine that wasn't on any official map, but she remembered it from childhood because the wind there always seemed to hush, no matter how strong it was on the ridge. They used to call it Whisper Hollow because it was quiet now, too quiet. It wasn't natural. Something had put it there. Further up, she noticed more claw marks, faint but fresh, tracing along bark at shoulder height, too high for any dog, too low for an elk. Mara squatted next to a fallen log, and looked around before spotting a low cave opening beneath an overhang that was almost obscured by fern and moss. Outside, she noticed more stones that weren't strewn all over the place. 6 stones of various shapes and colors arranged in a loose circle, a small pile of leaves, twigs, and what appeared to be soft, delicate, grayish-white animal fur in the middle. Mara's breath caught as she took a step closer. The circle hadn't been created by accident. It wasn't human. It was the result of an instinctive pattern ritual. She knelt down and gently touched one of the stones. It was warm, not from sunlight but from being close to life, and then she heard a sound she hadn't heard in years, a sound she'd only heard once, when her brother brought home a pair of abandoned fox kits to rehabilitate a small, high-pitched newborn. Her chest constricted, and she took a step back just as something moved at the cave's entrance. The bear, the same Grizzly from the cabin, emerged from the shadow like a ghost wearing flesh, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, nestled against her flank, were 2 cubs, tiny, blinking and wobbly on their legs. Mara froze, and the bear didn't growl or position. Instead, she just stood there, breathing calmly, and her eyes were fixed on her. It wasn't a warning but an invitation, and she fell to her knees without crying right away because it was too big for tears and full of something ancient. The grizzly had survived that storm, and she hadn't just survived. She had lived. She had carried life forward, and for some reason, she had brought Mara here to witness it. Not to threaten, not to conceal, but to share, as if that night in the cabin had bonded them beyond survival, and this moment was a return of that trust. As the monitor flatlined, a part of Mara that had been locked away for years in the hospital since she held her brother's hand felt like it would never feel life move forward again. She sat for more than an hour simply watching the cubs being nursed. The mother bear closed her eyes and was resting, but alert, and Mara, still and silent, felt something crack open in her. It had 4 paws and a heartbeat, and it was right in front of her. The visits became routine. Every morning, Mara would pack a small bundle of berries, fish scraps, and occasionally even boiled eggs, and she would walk the trail back toward the ravine. She never went too close, and the bear never demanded anything more. It wasn't dependence, but something else. The cubs were growing quickly. In a few weeks, they were bolder, wobbling farther away from the den, and their tiny paws were tumbling into each other like softened thunder. Mara named them in silence, Ash and Ember, not aloud, only in her journal, where she wrote at night by candlelight, recounting the silent stories of each visit like prayers she didn't want to forget. She never took pictures because she knew what would happen if she did. Some things are too alive to be captured. However, the world had begun to notice. It started with boot prints. She knelt down to examine them. Not a hiker's too wide heavy-heel military-style tread. She didn't panic yet, but when she saw the truck parked off the old fire road the next day, engine still warm, tailgate down, something twisted in her chest. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning Mara climbed fast, no offerings, no journal, only instinct. When she reached the ravine, the circle of stones was undisturbed, the cave mouth dark, and quiet. She waited, breath caught in the space between hope and dread, and then she heard it, not a growl, not the cubs' voices, male, two of them, and then a sound that shattered everything, a gunshot. Mara didn't think. She ran, heart pounding. She tore through branches, ducked low, scrambled across the moss-slick stones toward the clearing near the cave, and there they were, two men in camo, rifles slung over their backs, standing outside the den. One was laughing, the other was reloading. Mara stepped into the open without thinking. Get out of here, she shouted. They spun. One raised his rifle halfway, confused. What the hell? She's got cubs in there, Mara said, voice shaking. You fire again, and she'll defend them. You'll both be dead. The first man hesitated. The second, younger, looked uncertain. Lady, we're within rights. She's untagged. We didn't know you knew exactly. Mara snapped. You tracked her here, you baited her. Then from behind them the brush moved. The Grizzly emerged. Her eyes were calm, her shoulders low, but her teeth were bared just enough to speak warning. Mara stepped forward, arms wide. Go, she whispered. Now the younger man backed up. The older one looked at the bear, then at Mara, then back again, and something in him folded. He lowered his gun, spat at the ground, then walked. The younger followed. Mara stood there alone, heart racing. The Grizzly never came closer. She watched, waited, then slowly turned back toward the cave. Mara collapsed to her knees, not from fear, from something else, a realization. She wasn't protecting the bear. The bear had been trusting her to protect something more, her legacy, her children. And for the first time since her brother's funeral, Mara felt purpose, not as a burden, but as a gift. That night she didn't light a candle. She sat in darkness and wrote one line in her journal. She gave me her silence, and I gave her my voice, as if it were just another Thursday morning. The Rangers arrived the following morning with 2 cars, for people wearing badges and clipped voices. They discovered Mara caring for her garden. The woman who had previously sat quietly with a grizzly was now holding pruning shears and wearing gloves streaked with mud, but her heart was already racing. We received a report of gunfire near Whisper Hollow. Are you familiar with that area? Asked one of them. Mara looked him in the eyes. Yes, you were up there. She nodded as they asked her how long she had been going, whether she had seen any bears, whether she had been feeding them, and whether she knew that interfering with wildlife, especially grizzlies, was a federal offense. Mara's answers were measured and careful, but they were certain of one thing. Perhaps the hunters had reported her, perhaps someone else had seen the same prints, or perhaps it was simply too big to stay hidden forever. That night, she sat on the floor of her cabin, journal open, knowing the next step, and hating it. The only person she could call was Dr. Henry Voss, who had been the head of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, where Mara volunteered part-time while completing her degree in animal behavior 10 years prior to her brother's illness, before she quit everything and vanished into silence and grief. Dr. Voss hadn't heard from her in years, but he answered on the second ring. His voice broke in shock, and she took a breath and said, "I need help." The following day, he drove 6 hours to see her, and they walked the trail together. Not all the way to the ridge's edge, and she told him everything. Not just about the storm and the night in the cabin, not just about the cubs, but also about what had happened after her brother passed away, how she had become isolated, how she had nearly vanished herself, and how one quiet night by a wild animal had done what therapy, medication, and well-meaning friends couldn't make her feel alive again. Dr. Voss remained silent for a while before saying something that she hadn't heard before, and that you had recorded. Mara paused, then nodded, and she showed him the diaries, the sketches, the maps, the spiral stone, and the circle of rocks. His eyes were soft and non-calculating as he flipped each page slowly, his scientist's mind at work. "This is real," he said. "Do you know what you've done?" "I didn't do anything," she said, "choosing me within a week." Dr. Voss contacted his former colleagues. He submitted Mara's logs as an informal case study. No names, no coordinates, just a phenomenon: the reappearance of a previously untagged female grizzly demonstrating consistent non-aggressive interaction with a single human observer across multiple seasons, including while raising cubs. The response was cautious, skeptical, but something about the precision of her notes and the emotional tone behind them got through. One field officer requested a meeting, then another. Eventually the rangers came back, but this time they didn't bring questions. They brought tags, temporary, non-invasive, not to track her for capture, but to create a corridor of protection. Because of Mara's data, the area around Whisper Hollow was declared a non-disturbance zone temporarily at first, then permanently, after one of the cubs was spotted on camera 2 months later. The story didn't go public. Mara didn't want it to. No viral headlines, no interviews, but among those who understood the scientists, the rangers, the ones who lived between maps and forests, her name became legend. They called it the Hollow Pact, and none of them ever asked to see her notes again. They knew they weren't written for them, they were written for the bear. The snow arrived earlier than anticipated, and by mid-October, the air had become crisper and the clouds were hanging lower. Mara had intended to make one last trip to Whisper Hollow before the passes closed for the winter. She had only seen the bear twice, but she felt her presence always hovering just out of sight, like breath on glass. That morning, Mara packed only the necessities: dried food, gloves, a thick red parka, a simple tin of smoked fish that she knew they enjoyed, and a note on her kitchen table in case she needed to return before dark. The hike was peaceful, and she didn't bring her phone. It felt almost hallowed, the kind of silence that demands respect, as the trees stood motionless beneath a silver sky with no breeze or bird song, just the soft crunch of frost beneath her boots. She arrived at the ravine shortly after midday, and although the cave appeared unaltered, the stone circle had changed. 2 of the rocks were gone, and in their place were twigs arranged like a makeshift barrier or fence. She didn't immediately comprehend what the bear was attempting to communicate. She would only understand it later. The trail was almost invisible after the first one fell at 1:30 and another within 30 minutes. The wind howled over the ridge hard and cold, and suddenly, too quickly, Mara turned around, pulled her hood tight, and fought her way down the path. However, the snow thickened, the sky turned white, and soon she couldn't tell where the trail ended and the woods began. She was only a half-mile from the hollow, but by late afternoon, the forest no longer looked familiar. It looked like a different planet. Her breath was getting shorter, her vision was blurring, and she crawled beneath a fallen tree wedged beneath a rock outcrop. There was no shelter, but something that made her body curl against the cold. Her thoughts slowed, and she closed her eyes and muttered, "Not like this." A pause is then heard, followed by a steady, heavy sound, not Boots. Mara opened her eyes. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks, but no, there through the wall of snow a shape moved, massive, fluid. A bear. Her. The Grizzly stepped forward, slow and steady, until she stood just feet away. Her eyes were not wild, they were watchful. And then she did something Mara would never forget. She lowered herself, curled beside her, not touching, but close enough that Mara could feel the heat of her body, the same way she had done in that cabin all those months ago, only now. The roles had reversed. Mara didn't speak, she couldn't, but her tears came anyway, hot, fast, soundless. She lay there pressed against a tree with the wind screaming through the pines, and a wild bear at her side guarding her like a silent oath. And slowly sleep came, not from exhaustion, from safety. When she woke it was morning. The storm had passed, the snow was deep, but the trail was visible now, and beside it paw prints leading away. She never saw the bear leave, but she knew she had kept her warm, stayed through the night, watched the darkness for her. And in that moment Mara understood that night in the cabin had not been chance, it had been a beginning. She followed the tracks back home, slow and aching, and when she stepped through her own door, she whispered into the silence. You remembered spring came slow that year. The snow took its time melting from the ridge. The streams ran high and clear, cutting through the stone with a fierce rhythm. Trees budded later than usual. It was Mildmay before Mara finally returned to Whisper Hollow. She hadn't seen the Grizzly since that storm, but she'd felt her everywhere, in the silence between waking and sleep, in the way the wind moved through her window at night, in the small stone she still kept on her kitchen shelf, the one with a spiral scratched into its side. She didn't know what she would find this time, but she knew she needed to go one last time. The trail was dry, the ravine smelled like thawing earth and pine needles. She moved slowly, not out of fear but respect, like entering a place that remembered her. When she arrived at the cave, she stopped. The circle of stones had vanished, and in its place was something new. A pile of smooth river rocks stacked in a carefully balanced tower, and next to it, half hidden beneath a patch of moss, a wooden object. Her hands were shaking as she brushed the moss aside. It was the lid of a weathered box, which she opened to reveal a small bundle of soft, clean gray fur that had been carefully tied with a pine needle. Beneath it was a piece of birch bark that was curled at the edges, and on it was a mark, a single curved line, a spiral drawn with a claw rather than a pen. Mara didn't cry at first. She held the box in her lap, sat beside the stones, and looked out over the forest. Everything was alive, everything was still, and in that stillness she felt the presence again, not near, but not gone either, just carried forward. Ash and Ember, the cubs she'd watched nurse beneath the trees, had been seen on trail cams, now larger, stronger, moving with confidence. Rangers had logged multiple sightings, always together, always near Whisper Hollow, but never near people, never again near her. And Mara understood that had been the promise to come back once more, to share something final, to say goodbye. Without speaking it, she placed the box back beneath the stone tower, added one more rock to the stack, then stood, and for the first time in a long time she didn't look back. She didn't need to, because some goodbyes don't mean the end, they mean it. Worked back at home, she wrote one last line in her journal. I gave her shelter once, she gave me everything else. A year later, a ranger would find the stone tower again. He'd notice the spiral scratched into the birch bark. He'd file it as natural markings and move on, but the forest would remember, and so would Mara, because the Grizzly had returned, not just to survive, but to say thank you. If this story touched you, remember, sometimes the quietest bonds are the ones that change us the most. And trust, real trust, doesn't need language, it just needs presence. Join the channel. She wasn't just a bear, So please like and share this tale with someone who still appreciates the natural world's serene beauty.